The sun was just starting to warm the city streets when Mr. Taylor pulled into his usual parking spot, the one with the small sign reading "Reserved for CEO." He sat in his car for a moment, looking at the gleaming 15-story building with the words Capital Trust Bank displayed proudly across the top. It was his bank, not just where he kept his money, but the institution he had built from nothing over the past 15 years. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the passenger seat and nodded at the security guard as he walked through the lobby. Everyone smiled and greeted him respectfully. "Good morning, Mr. Taylor." "Beautiful day, sir." "Can I get you your usual coffee, Mr. Taylor?" This was normal for him, the respect, the immediate attention, the way doors seemed to open before he even reached for the handle. But something had been bothering him lately. 3 complaint letters sat on his desk, each one telling a similar story. Black customers waiting longer for service, extra questions when they tried to cash checks, loan officers suddenly too busy when certain people asked about mortgages. The letters described a very different bank than the one he thought he was running. "It can't be happening at my bank," he had told his assistant yesterday. "We have policies against this kind of treatment." "Policies on paper don't always match what happens in real life," his assistant had replied quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. That comment had kept him awake all night. What if people were having completely different experiences in his bank based on how they looked? The thought made his stomach hurt. Mr. Taylor reached his top-floor office and settled behind his large desk, but instead of opening his email, he stared out the window at the city below. How could he really know what was happening in his branches? The regional managers always gave glowing reports. Customer service scores were good overall. But what if they only reflected the experiences of certain customers? He picked up the phone and called his most trusted friend on the board of directors. "I need your honest opinion on something," he said after they exchanged greetings. "Do you think it's possible that some of our branches might be treating black customers differently?" There was a long pause on the line. "I think it's not just possible, it's likely," his friend finally answered. "Banking has that problem everywhere. Why do you ask?" Mr. Taylor explained about the complaint letters. "I want to know what's really happening, not what people tell me is happening." "So what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking of going undercover, visiting different branches as a regular customer, seeing what happens when people don't know I'm the boss." His friend let out a low whistle. "That could work, but you have to really change your appearance. Everyone knows what you look like." They talked for another half hour, working out the details. Mr. Taylor would skip his regular haircut, grow out his beard over the weekend, and wear regular clothes instead of his usual tailored suits. He would leave his fancy watch and signet ring at home. He would carry only his personal ID and regular debit card, nothing that showed his position. "I'll start next week," Mr. Taylor decided. "I'll visit the downtown branch first. That's where 2 of the complaints came from." After hanging up, he called in his assistant and shared the plan. "This could be eye-opening," his assistant said. "But what will you do if you find out the complaints are true?" Mr. Taylor looked down at the letters on his desk again. "Then I'll fix it. This is my bank. Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect I get. If that's not happening, then I've failed at building the bank I thought I was building." He stood up and walked to the window again, watching people enter and exit the bank below. "One way or another, I'm going to find out the truth, and then I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." When Monday morning arrived, Mr. Taylor stood in front of his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing himself. 4 days without shaving had left him with a scruffy beard that changed his whole face. His normally clean-cut appearance had transformed into something much more casual, even a bit disheveled. "This feels strange," he said to himself, running a hand over his chin. He'd spent years making sure he looked the part of a successful bank CEO, tailored suits, perfect haircuts, shined shoes. Looking professional was part of his identity. Now he was trying to look like anybody else, just a regular guy walking into a bank. He opened his closet and pushed past the row of expensive suits. Way in the back, he found what he was looking for, old jeans he wore when doing yard work, a plain button-up shirt he'd had for years, and a pair of scuffed casual shoes. He got dressed and looked in the mirror again. The transformation was working. Even his own mother might walk past him on the street. The final touch was removing his watch. the expensive one his board had given him when the bank hit its 10-year anniversary. He placed it carefully in its box and instead strapped on an old digital watch he'd found in a drawer. No fancy cufflinks, no tie, no designer anything. His wife walked into the bedroom and stopped short. "Wow," she said, shaking her head. "I wouldn't have recognized you if I passed you on the street." "That's the idea," Mr. Taylor replied. "I need to be invisible. Just another customer." She looked worried. "Are you sure about this? What if you find out things you don't want to know?" He sighed. "That's exactly what I need to find out. Better to know the truth than live with a lie." He grabbed his old wallet, emptied of everything except his personal ID, a credit card, and $200 in cash. No business cards, nothing that connected him to his real position. "Which branch are you visiting first?" his wife asked. "Downtown. I'll try to cash a check, ask about a loan, see what happens." He kissed her goodbye and headed for the door. Instead of taking his usual car, he called a rideshare. The driver barely glanced at him as he climbed into the back seat. "Downtown, please," Mr. Taylor said. "The corner of 5th and Main." During the drive, he rehearsed his story in his head. He was just a guy needing to cash a check. Maybe ask about refinancing his home. Simple banking tasks that should be straightforward for any customer. The car stopped a block away from the downtown branch. Mr. Taylor paid the driver and got out, suddenly feeling nervous. He'd walked into his own banks hundreds of times, but never like this, never as just another customer, never wondering how he'd be treated. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching people enter and exit the bank. A white woman in a business suit walked in and was immediately greeted with smiles. An older white man followed, receiving the same warm welcome. Then a young black woman with a small child. He noticed the greeter's smile seemed less enthusiastic, more forced. "Here goes nothing," he muttered to himself. He took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, trying to adopt the body language of someone who wasn't used to owning the place. Shoulders slightly hunched, eyes down, moving a bit more hesitantly than his usual confident stride. As he pulled open the heavy glass door, he reminded himself to be observant, notice everything. How long before someone acknowledged him? What was their tone like? Their body language? Did they make eye contact? Did they smile? He stepped inside, and the familiar smell of his bank hit him, that clean, professional scent he'd specifically chosen years ago. The marble floors gleamed. The lighting was perfect, just as he'd specified. Everything looked exactly as it should. But would it feel the same? Would his own creation welcome him as warmly as it welcomed others? Mr. Taylor took another deep breath and walked toward the teller line, about to find out if his bank lived up to the promises he'd made about equal treatment for all. Mr. Taylor joined the line at his downtown branch, standing behind 3 other customers. He noticed right away how different it felt to be on this side of the counter. The line moved slowly. The air conditioning seemed too cold. The chairs in the waiting area looked less comfortable than he remembered. The customer in front of him, an older white man in a golf shirt, finished his transaction quickly. The teller smiled warmly and called out, "Have a wonderful day, sir." Then it was Mr. Taylor's turn. He stepped up to the counter and gave a friendly nod. "Good morning." The teller's smile faded slightly. She didn't respond to his greeting, just asked flatly, "How can I help you?" Mr. Taylor placed a check on the counter. It was his own personal check from his home account, made out to cash for $350. "I'd like to cash this, please." The teller picked up the check, examining it closely, much more closely than she had looked at the previous customer's transaction. "Do you have an account with us?" she asked, her tone cool and professional. "Yes, I do," he replied. "I'll need to see 2 forms of ID," she said. Mr. Taylor knew this wasn't standard procedure. The bank's policy required only one government-issued ID for existing customers cashing checks under $500. He'd written that policy himself. "I have my driver's license," he said, sliding it across the counter. "I thought that was all I needed." The teller frowned. "We prefer 2 IDs for transactions like this. Do you have anything else?" "A credit card, maybe." A white woman at the next window over was cashing a much larger check. Mr. Taylor could clearly see she had only shown one ID. "Actually," he said calmly, I believe bank policy only requires one government-issued ID for existing customers cashing checks under $500. That's my understanding. The teller's expression hardened. Sir, I'm just trying to follow procedure. If you don't have another ID, I'll need to check with my supervisor. That's fine, Mr. Taylor said. He watched as she walked over to a man in a dark suit, the branch manager, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Taylor had hired him 3 years ago. They'd had lunch together just last month to discuss the branch's performance. Mr. Wilson glanced over at him, then leaned down to whisper something to the teller. She nodded and returned. I can cash your check with just the one ID, she said, her voice stiff. But for future reference, printing 2 forms is always better. Thank you, Mr. Taylor replied. I'll remember that. She processed his transaction without another word, counting out the cash methodically before sliding it across the counter. No smile, no have a nice day. Just a silent stare that seemed to say she was done with him. Mr. Taylor pocketed the money and decided to push further. Actually, I was hoping to speak with someone about refinancing my home loan while I'm here. Are any of your loan officers available? The teller glanced over at the desk area where 2 loan officers sat. Both appeared to be free, scrolling through their computers. They're all busy with appointments right now, she said. You can call and schedule something for next week if you want. Mr. Taylor nodded toward the loan officers. They don't look busy to me. The teller's lips tightened. They're preparing for appointments, she said shortly. If you want, you can leave your name and number, and someone will call you. I'd really prefer to speak with someone today if possible, Mr. Taylor insisted gently. I'm making a decision this weekend. The teller sighed loudly, making no effort to hide her annoyance. She picked up the phone and spoke quietly, then turned back to him. Mr. Reynolds will see you, but he only has a few minutes. She pointed to the waiting area. Have a seat. Mr. Taylor thanked her and moved to the chairs. He watched as a white couple walked in and was immediately directed to a loan officer, the same ones who had been 2 busy moments before. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Mr. Taylor waited patiently, observing everything. He watched as 2 more white customers came in and received immediate attention. After 20 minutes, a loan officer finally approached. I understand you wanted to discuss refinancing, he asked, not bothering to introduce himself or offer a handshake. Yes, Mr. Taylor said, if you still have time. The loan officer checked his watch. I can give you 5 minutes. Mr. Taylor followed the loan officer to a small desk in the corner. Not the private offices where important customers were usually taken, but a desk in the open area where conversations could be overheard by anyone nearby. So, refinancing, the loan officer said, not looking up as he tapped at his keyboard. He hadn't offered his name, though Mr. Taylor recognized him as Mr. Reynolds, someone who had been with the bank for about 2 years. What's your current rate? 4.8%, Mr. Taylor replied. I've had my mortgage for about 7 years now. Mr. Reynolds glanced up briefly. And you're looking to refinance because? Rates have dropped. I think I could get a better deal now. Mr. Reynolds typed something else. What's your credit score? Around 820, Mr. Taylor said. For the first time, Mr. Reynolds looked directly at him, surprise crossing his face before he quickly masked it. That's quite high. Do you have proof of that score? Mr. Taylor hadn't brought any documentation, which was intentional. Any loan officer at his bank should be offering to check a potential customer's credit as part of the refinancing discussion. It was part of their standard procedure. I don't have it with me, Mr. Taylor said. But you could run a credit check, right? Mr. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. We could, but there's a fee for that. Before we go through all that trouble, let me just ask, what's your income? Refinancing might not make sense if you're not going to qualify for our best rates anyway. Again, this wasn't procedure. Income verification came after the initial consultation, not before the loan officer even explained the refinancing options. I make enough, Mr. Taylor said carefully. I've never missed a mortgage payment. I have substantial savings. I'm just looking to understand what rates you're offering these days. The loan officer sighed and glanced at his watch again. Look, our premium rates, the ones below 3%, those are really for our priority customers. People with significant deposits with us, multiple accounts, that sort of thing. Mr. Taylor nodded slowly. I see. And what qualifies someone as a priority customer? Generally, people who maintain balances over $50,000 across their accounts, Mr. Reynolds replied, his tone suggesting this was clearly out of Mr. Taylor's reach. This was completely false. The bank had no such policy. Their best rates were available to anyone with good credit, regardless of their deposit amounts. That's interesting, Mr. Taylor said. Your website doesn't mention anything about needing to be a priority customer to get the best rates. It just mentions credit score requirements. Mr. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Well, the website gives general information. The reality is a bit more nuanced. Through the glass wall of the branch manager's office, Mr. Taylor could see a white couple being offered coffee as they settled into comfortable chairs. They looked to be in their 30s, dressed casually, certainly not giving off the appearance of wealth. Yet they were receiving the VIP treatment. I see, Mr. Taylor said again, keeping his voice level. So even with my excellent credit score, you don't think I'd qualify for your best rates? I didn't say that, Mr. Reynolds backtracked slightly. But refinancing is complicated. There are closing costs to consider. It might not be worth it for you. He glanced at his watch yet again. Look, I need to prepare for my next appointment. Why don't you think about it and come back with your full documentation if you want to proceed? Bring recent pay stubs, bank statements for the past 6 months, tax returns for the last 2 years, and proof of your credit score. Mr. Taylor knew this was an excessive list of documentation for an initial consultation. Most customers would be discouraged by such requirements. One last question, Mr. Taylor said as Mr. Reynolds stood up, clearly eager to end their meeting. What's the current rate for someone with my credit profile? Just a ballpark figure. Mr. Reynolds hesitated. Probably around 4.5%, he said finally. This was a lie. The bank was currently offering 2.8% to qualified borrowers. Thank you for your time, Mr. Taylor said, standing up. He'd seen enough. As he walked toward the exit, he noticed the branch manager personally escorting the white couple to a loan officer's desk, laughing and chatting with them as if they were old friends. Mr. Taylor pushed through the glass doors and stepped outside. The evidence was clear. The complaints he'd received weren't exaggerations or misunderstandings. They reflected a disturbing reality in his own bank. Now he had to decide what to do about it. Mr. Taylor sat in a coffee shop across the street from his bank, watching people come and go through the glass doors. His hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. The extra ID requirement, the long wait, the misleading information about interest rates, the clear difference in how he'd been treated compared to white customers. He pulled out his phone and made some notes while everything was fresh in his memory. Times, names, specific comments. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was systematic. It was exactly what the complaint letters had described. As he typed, a plan began forming in his mind. He could walk back into that bank right now, reveal his identity, and demand answers. The looks on their faces would be satisfying. But would that solve the real problem? This wasn't just about one branch or a few employees. If it was happening here, it could be happening at all 30 of his branches. Mr. Taylor finished his coffee and made a decision. He would visit one more branch today, unannounced and still undercover. He needed to know if this was a pattern. An hour later, he walked into his bank's Midtown branch. The experience was disturbingly similar. The same cool reception. The same extra scrutiny of his ID. When he asked to speak to someone about business loans, the teller told him all the business loan officers were in meetings, despite Mr. Taylor clearly seeing one chatting with a colleague by the coffee machine. After being kept waiting for 20 minutes, he was finally introduced to a loan officer who spent more time looking at his computer screen than at Mr. Taylor. The officer handed him a basic brochure about business loans rather than discussing actual options, saying he'd need to submit an extensive application before they could talk specifics. Most small businesses don't qualify for our premium products, the loan officer added, despite knowing nothing about Mr. Taylor's financial situation. By mid-afternoon, Mr. Taylor had seen enough. He returned to his home, changed back into one of his usual suits, and drove to the main office. His assistant looked up in surprise when he walked in. He'd told her he'd be out all day. Call an emergency meeting of the executive team for tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., he said, his voice calm but firm. And I need the branch managers from downtown and midtown to be there too. Is everything okay? His assistant asked, clearly concerned by his expression. No, Mr. Taylor replied honestly, but it will be. He worked late into the evening, reviewing the bank's training materials, hiring practices, and customer service policies. Everything on paper looked right. The bank explicitly prohibited discrimination. They had diversity training. Their marketing materials showed people of all backgrounds. But clearly, something was broken between policy and practice. Around midnight, his wife brought him a sandwich and sat beside him at the kitchen table. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Mr. Taylor looked up from his laptop. "I'm going to fix this. Not with a band-aid, but from the ground up." He showed her the outline of his plan. New mystery shopper programs using customers of different races, revised training that included specific scenarios about unconscious bias, a complete overhaul of how branch performance was measured with equal treatment metrics given the same weight as sales goals. "Do you think it will work?" she asked. "It has to," he said simply. "This is my bank. My name is on it. Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect and the same treatment. I won't accept anything less." He closed his laptop and rubbed his tired eyes. Tomorrow would be difficult. The branch managers would be defensive. Some executives might push back against changes that could temporarily reduce profits. But Mr. Taylor was more determined than ever. He thought about the small moments of dismissal and disrespect he'd experienced today. How many customers had walked away feeling the same way? How many had simply given up, convinced the system wasn't built for them? The thought made him even more resolved. As he finally headed to bed, Mr. Taylor mentally prepared for the confrontation to come. He wasn't just fighting for the reputation of his bank anymore. He was fighting for something much more important: the simple dignity of equal treatment for every person who walked through his doors. The conference room fell silent as Mr. Taylor walked in at exactly 8 a.m. The executive team was already seated, along with the downtown and midtown branch managers. Coffee cups steamed in front of them. Some were checking emails on their phones. Others were chatting quietly. All conversation stopped when they saw his face. "Good morning," Mr. Taylor said, his voice steady. He remained standing at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Mr. Wilson, the downtown branch manager, smiled nervously. "Is everything all right, sir? Your assistant said it was urgent." "No," Mr. Taylor replied simply. "Everything is not all right." He placed 2 photos on the table. One showed him in his disguise from yesterday, casual clothes, beard, no expensive accessories. The other showed him in his usual suit and tie. "Do you recognize both of these men?" Confused glances traveled around the table. The chief financial officer spoke up. "Well, one is you, sir. The other," he squinted at the photo, "I don't recognize him." "That's also me," Mr. Taylor said. "Yesterday, I visited the downtown and midtown branches dressed like this." He pointed to the casual photo. "I wanted to experience our bank the way our customers do. I wanted to see if the complaints we've been receiving had any merit." The room grew even quieter. Mr. Wilson's face had gone pale. "Mr. Wilson, do you remember a man who came in yesterday morning to cash a $350 check? Who waited 20 minutes to speak with Mr. Reynolds about refinancing, only to be told he probably wouldn't qualify and quoted a rate much higher than what we actually offer?" Mr. Wilson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mr. Taylor turned to the Midtown branch manager. "And Ms. Lee, do you recall a man who was told all your business loan officers were in meetings, despite one clearly being available? Who was given a brochure instead of actual help?" Ms. Lee looked down at the table. "That was me," Mr. Taylor continued. "I experienced firsthand what some of our customers have been complaining about. Different standards, extra requirements, misleading information, assumptions made based on appearance." He took a seat finally, looking each person in the eye. "I'm not here to fire anyone today. I'm here because we have a serious problem that goes beyond individual employees. What I experienced suggests a culture that's inconsistent with our values, our mission, and frankly, with basic human decency." The bank's chief of operations cleared his throat. "Sir, if certain employees were unprofessional, we can address that immediately." This isn't about being unprofessional, Mr. Taylor said firmly. It's about treating people differently based on how they look. I watched white customers receive immediate attention while I was told to wait. I was asked for extra ID that our policy doesn't require. I was quoted rates that were deliberately misleading. He opened a folder and handed out copies of a document to everyone. This is my plan for addressing these issues. It starts today. The executives scanned the document with varying expressions of surprise and concern. Mandatory bias training for every employee, from tellers to me, Mr. Taylor explained. A new mystery shopper program with people of different races and backgrounds. A complete revision of our performance metrics to prioritize equal treatment. A review of all loan applications from the past year to look for patterns of inequality. The chief financial officer frowned. Sir, this will be expensive, and the performance metric changes could affect our quarterly numbers. I don't care, Mr. Taylor said, his voice quiet but firm. What's the cost of our integrity? What's the value of our reputation? How much business have we already lost from customers who felt unwelcome or were turned away from opportunities they deserved? He stood up again. This isn't open for debate. This is happening. The only question is whether you're on board or not. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Mr. Wilson spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, sir. I had no idea this was happening in my branch. That's part of the problem, Mr. Taylor replied. You should have known. We all should have known. And now that we do, we're going to fix it. He looked around the table one more time. Meeting dismissed. Except for Mr. Wilson and Ms. Lee. I'd like you both to stay. We have some specific incidents to discuss. As the executives filed out, the weight of what was coming began to settle over the two branch managers. The day of reckoning had arrived. 6 months had passed since that tense morning meeting. Mr. Taylor stood in the lobby of his downtown branch, watching customers come and go. Things looked different now. Not just the new signs that read "Equal Service for All" prominently displayed at every teller window, but the feeling in the air, the way employees interacted with everyone who walked through the door. He was dressed in regular clothes today, jeans and a casual shirt, but not as a disguise. He had made it a habit to visit his branches regularly this way, sometimes announced, sometimes not. The employees knew he might show up anytime, looking like any other customer. Good morning, sir. How can I help you today? The young teller smiled warmly at an elderly black man who had just approached her window. Mr. Taylor watched as she handled his transaction with the same respect and attention she'd given the white businessman before him. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. The latest numbers had come in from their new customer satisfaction survey, the one that tracked responses by race, age, and gender. For the 4th month in a row, the scores showed consistent service across all groups. The gap that had existed before was nearly gone. It hadn't been easy. Some longtime employees had resisted the changes. A few had even quit rather than adapt to the new requirements. Mr. Taylor hadn't tried to stop them. The bank was better off without people who couldn't treat all customers fairly. The changes had gone far beyond just attitude. They had rewritten loan qualification procedures to remove any subjective elements that could allow bias to creep in. Loan officers now used a standardized checklist that focused solely on financial qualifications. Branch managers reviewed all loan rejections to ensure they were based on legitimate financial factors. The mystery shopper program had been the most eye-opening for many employees. Pairs of shoppers, one white, one a person of color, with identical financial profiles, would visit branches and record their experiences. In the early months, the differences had been striking. Now, those differences had virtually disappeared. Mr. Taylor. He turned to see Mr. Wilson, the downtown branch manager, approaching with a smile. Their relationship had changed dramatically since that confrontational meeting. After getting over his initial defensiveness, Mr. Wilson had become one of the strongest champions for the new policies. The community workshop is all set up in the conference room, Mr. Wilson said. We've got about 40 people signed up. This was another new initiative, free financial education workshops for underserved communities. The bank had partnered with local organizations to offer classes on building credit, saving for homeownership, and starting small businesses. Perfect, Mr. Taylor replied. I'll be there to kick it off. As they walked toward the conference room, Mr. Wilson said quietly, "You know, I've been meaning to thank you." "For what?" "For not firing me that day, for giving me a chance to be part of the solution. I honestly didn't see what was happening before, but now," he shook his head, "I can't unsee it." Mr. Taylor nodded. That was the whole point. Once you see it, you can't ignore it. They reached the conference room where community members were gathering. Mr. Taylor recognized many faces, people who might have been ignored or underserved by his bank in the past. Now they were welcomed as valued customers and community partners. As he stepped to the front of the room to welcome everyone, Mr. Taylor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The bank's profits hadn't suffered. In fact, they'd grown as new customers from previously underserved communities came through their doors. Employee morale was higher. Their reputation in the community had strengthened. But most importantly, people were being treated with the dignity and respect they deserved, no matter what they looked like or how they dressed when they walked through those doors. After his brief welcome speech, Mr. Taylor stayed for the workshop, sitting among the participants rather than at the front of the room. An older woman beside him leaned over. "This is my first time in this bank," she whispered. "My neighbor told me it was different from other banks, that they really treat everyone right here." Mr. Taylor smiled. "That's what we strive for every day." "Well," she said, "you've earned yourself a new customer." Those simple words meant more to him than any profit report or industry award ever could.